setting, very top there. Swap.
Thank you, Dan. So literature review I wrote for Sociology 344, Mass Communication and Popular Culture, and it's on the topic of video games and whether or not they're effective learning tools. And I'd like to thank William for bringing up, yeah, just setting it up real nicely. So digital savagery. Text messages. Do they desensitize us from human connection, or do they allow a deeper sense of intimacy? Televisions. Are they mind-washing machines designed to keep society enslaved upon the couch? Or are they educational viewports which look out onto a world too vast to comprehend without their magic? Video games. Are they easy ways for children to become infatuated with crime and violence? Or are they advanced machines of education designed for interactivity and applicability? Although not without opposition, it's the consensus of the authors which I've researched that video games not only have a positive influence on cognitive training, but also allow for a truly revolutionary way of thinking about, looking at, and interacting with the world in which we live. Some criticisms. First one is that mercy doesn't have an experience point value. Now here we have the popular video, you guys have probably heard of The Punisher, the movie. This is the video game, The Punisher, and it's an incredible game, and throughout it, you're trying to extract information from these guys, right? And this is like this scene here is highly interactive. You got like your joystick is controlling like how close his crotch is to the saw blade, and once you get the information out of him, you can choose to either like knock him out and throw him in the corner, or like cut his nuts off. And you know, people begin to wonder, people begin to think and question that if this is what we're doing in the game, and you're rewarded for this in the game, you get progress throughout the game. So if this is what you're being rewarded for in-game, how are children and anybody really taking those lessons and applying them in real life, or are they? You know, or do they have this distinction between real life and video games? 96.8% of male video game users objectify the virtual environment, as well as use others for their personal gain. It's not surprising. Another criticism is that video games are full of incorrect or incomplete information. As we can see here, as far as I know of the textbooks I've read, there were no actual Nazi zombies. And the accurate games are hardly any fun. As we can see here, we have a Wii game where we're going to present evidence in court with the swing of the Wii remote. Why is this? It's pretty simple. It's because game designers design games. They're not very good at educating, and educators educate. They're not very good typically at designing games. You know, there is these exceptions to the rule, but it's this culture of specialization. You know, if I want to be a game designer, I get good at entertaining people. If I want to be an educator, I get good at teaching people, and there's rarely much bleed through. What can be done about this? In one of the papers that I was reviewing, I came across a fairly ingenious method, and I think it would just best be explained with an example. Say I'm teaching a history class, and I want to let my students play for maybe they don't learn well at reading or just listening to me lecture, so I get them to go play Call of Duty, and they go like kill a bunch of Nazis, and they go through all these battles. I get them to play levels 1 through 5. And then the next day in class, they come in and I say, okay, well, what happened? You know, tell me about the story behind the battles that you were in. And they tell me, and then I say to them, well, this is what the book's, you know, this is the recorded version of history. And then we critique and analyze that and look at what's different between what's being portrayed in education and what's being recorded in history, you know, in educational history. And why maybe is that different? Is it different for an educational purpose or an entertainment purpose? Is it not? Is the true version not as fun or as exciting? You know, like Nazi zombies, come on. And then at the same time, so then we can really highlight this in the children's or the young adults' minds. And again, to touch on William's conversation, why should something be done about this? Is because sitting around and listening to a lecture all the time, I mean, I take it well in some classes, and in other classes, I don't like the lecture. I want some other type of learning. And this is immediately applicable, because if I'm learning history, it's not applicable. It's like, how am I going to use what happened 500 years ago to further and better my life now? And you can memorize it fairly simply, but that's all it is memorization. There's no applicability. So now when these students, go back 10 years down the road and they're playing their favorite Call of Duty game again, they're going to be in this battle and they're going to be, hey, you know, this here, maybe they tell their friends, this here is actually incorrect information and this is what actually happened. Because I think that we can relate a little bit the virtual environment to our real environment. It's applicable in a virtual environment that I hang out in. That's just as good as being applicable in my real life. Games are a highly valued source of learning because of the necessity to, within them, employ a great deal of higher order thinking, which is the thinking involved in such processes as hypothesis testing and strategization. Higher order thinking is key in developing such faculties as morality, discipline, and the ability to progressively improve one's decisions based on the results of previous similar decisions, which in turn enhances the ability to resolve future unrelated cognitive disequilibriums. Games present pseudo-realistic processes to the player, which the player must overcome or otherwise deal with. And these processes are modeled after the way that the real world works. Therefore, video gamers have the unique opportunity to run hypothesis experiments in padded environments. A couple of definitions here. Cognitive disequilibrium as defined by Eck. Cognitive disequilibrium is when one holds two contradictory beliefs about the world, and it forces one to adapt either one or the other belief so that one's worldview realigns harmoniously. For example, if I believe that God doesn't do harm to righteous people, and I believe my neighbor is a righteous person, and then God, or maybe not God specifically, but say his wife dies, and that's terrible. You know, God doesn't let bad things happen to righteous people. So I have two options here. I can either redefine my concept of the nature of God and what God allows to happen to righteous people, or I can redefine my view of my neighbor and exactly how righteous is he. So one way or another, my mind will inherently bring that back into equilibrium. Procedural rhetoric is the way in which interactive environments, such as video games, say things about the world. They present procedures which the user must experience to progress in such a way that there's an underlying message about the thing what one is experiencing at that moment. Here we have some Animal Crossing, a Nintendo game, and here we have a bunch of economics textbooks. What's the different and what's the same? The difference is accessibility. We all know how simple it is to go pick up a Nintendo game, and we all know how simple it is to continue to be motivated to engage with that video game. On the other hand, I'm sure that everybody in this room, at the very least, is aware of how much more difficult it is to get yourself financially and general lifestyles set up to depart from the typical path for a while and turn into an education in economics, say, and more importantly, how difficult it is to stay motivated in something especially as peculiar as economics. What's the same as the results? This is a big part of my review was this article by Ian Bogost, and he's plays Animal Crossing, which is what the rest of this presentation is about, and it's some pretty deep stuff. Animal Crossing is a video game in which, quote, the player is penniless upon arrival, and the game quickly thrusts him into the reality of making ends meet, end quote. To a critical mind, Animal Crossing models consumer capitalism. Bogost's 5-year-old plays Animal Crossing as well, and so is placed into the procedural rhetoric of consumer capitalism and faced with the cognitive disequilibrium of whether or not to take out a mortgage on a larger home. She wants a big house, like her dad's Animal Crossing house. Also, she wants to buy more material goods, like toys and couches and wallpaper, but she needs more space to put it all in. Yet the more she spends on mortgage payments, the less she's able to spend on new stuff. And so here we have a surprisingly complex system of contradictions of desires, but it is laid out in a way that this 5-year-old knows what's going on and approximately how to deal with it. In real life, when we pay our mortgage bill, we don't see where the money ends up. But in Animal Crossing, the player experiences the way his debt makes the bankers wealthy. After a player makes a major payment to his mortgage, Tom Nook, who's the lender, closes his shop and upgrades it. The game starts with Nook's Cranny, a wooden shack general store, and ends with Nookington's, a two-story department store. Tom Nook is a condensation of the corporate bourgeoisie. Tom is the only character in which the player makes transactions of any kind with, and so it is easy to see the effects of the redistribution of wealth in ways children are fully capable of comprehending. Now, we have discussed the most common objections which arise, being that especially men tend to objectify the environment and others for their personal gain, which obviously brings up questions about ethics, morality, and to what effect such behaviors in-game will carry over into real life. The other objection was that games which are enjoyable, not educational, games which are educational aren't enjoyable. In response to this latter objection, there was proposed a ingenious method of allowing the educators to educate with what the designers designed, and regardless of the content therein. To conclude, we discussed cognitive disequilibrium within the environment of procedural rhetoric. I feel confident in restating that video games not only have a positive influence on cognitive training, but also allow for a truly revolutionary way of thinking about, looking at, and interacting with the world in which we live. And I didn't have time to cover it in my presentation, but in the full version of the paper, I go into a lot of detail on massive multiplayer online games and how the research that has been done to show the transition of things like altruism from people who are reserved socially in real life are able to be altruistic and be caring and kind in virtual massive multiplayer environments. Something to do with that shield effect, right? So here's some sources. If you want to see the full paper or you want to read more about these sources, you can contact me here, or if you want to read more of my essays, you can go here.